They found her in the center of a scorched circle, barefoot and bleeding, a broken fence post raised at an army of 400, and not one of those 400 moved. The sun was going down. The sky behind the ridge had turned the color of a dying fire, all deep orange and bruised purple. And the meadow below was still except for the slow curl of smoke rising from the grass. It had been scorched in a wide, uneven ring. Not by lightning, not by accident, by something that had come from inside a person and had nowhere left to go but out. King Xaden Valehart's war column had crested the ridge at a steady pace, 400 wolves in full battle order, iron and leather, and the quiet, controlled energy of soldiers who had been at war long enough to not flinch at anything. But when the column reached the ridge's edge, it stopped, but not on command, not because a horn was blown or a hand was raised. It stopped the way water stops at the edge of a cliff, because what lay below it demanded a moment of stillness. 11 bodies were arranged around the scorched ring, the way a storm arranges debris. Not placed, thrown. Some had made it to the ring's edge. Some had not made it far at all. At the center of the ring stood a girl. She was not large. She was not armored. She wore a torn dress the color of ash and boots, so broken that the sole of the left one had mostly separated from the upper, flapping loose with every small shift of her weight. Her arms were trembling, not from fear, but from the specific exhaustion of someone who has pushed past every limit their body had and is now running on something that is not quite strength anymore, something older than strength. It's something that does not have a name, most people know. In her 2 hands, she held a splintered fence post. Behind her, 4 small children pressed themselves against a crumbling stone wall, the only piece of the ruined meadow outbuilding still standing. The youngest was a boy of about 3. He had both fists wrapped in the hem of her dress, his face buried against the back of her knee. He was not crying. He was past crying. He was simply holding on, the way very small children hold on when they have decided that this particular person is the only solid thing left in the world. The last raider, the one who had managed to stay conscious, was dragging himself toward the tree line on his forearms, leaving a trail through the scorched grass. The girl watched him go with calm, steady eyes. She did not chase him. She did not finish it. She let him go because she was not a hunter. She had never been a hunter. She was something else entirely. Something that only rises when there is no other choice, when the things worth protecting are small and terrified and have no one else. The raider disappeared into the dark between the trees. The girl turned. Her eyes moved up the ridge with the careful, measuring quality of someone who has learned to calculate threats quickly, because being slow at it costs more than you can afford. She found the column, 400 wolves, battle-hardened and unmoving, staring down at her from the ridge in absolute silence. She did not run. She raised the fence post higher. Her hands, the hands that gripped it, were still faintly glowing. Not brightly. Not the way they had been glowing 7 minutes ago, when the meadow had been filled with gold-white light that none of the scouts at the column's edge had ever seen in their lifetimes. Just faintly. Like an ember that has given everything it has and is slowly cooling back to what the world would call ordinary. The thing was, she had never been ordinary. The world she came from had simply never given her a reason to be anything else. No one at the top of that ridge knew her name yet. No one knew where she had come from, or what she had survived, or why there were 4 children behind her and 11 raiders on the ground around her, and a scorched circle in the grass that would still be visible in that meadow 3 seasons later. but every wolf in that column felt something, a pressure behind the sternum, a settling of the air, or the particular silence that falls when you are in the presence of something the world has not produced in a very long time, and the world does not quite know what to do with the fact that it is back. At the head of the column, King Xaden Valahart sat on his horse and looked down at the girl with the fence post, and felt his wolf, a vast, ancient, battle-hardened creature that had not once shown softness in 14 years of war, go completely, perfectly still, not in submission, not in aggression, in recognition. He dismounted. His general, Eric's Ravenwood, moved his horse a half-step forward and said nothing. He knew better. He had ridden at Xaden's right for 9 years, and in 9 years he had learned that when the king dismounted without a word and started walking toward something, that you stayed back and you trusted the instinct that had kept him alive through 3 wars and 100 things that should have ended him before the first. Xaden walked down from the ridge alone. 400 wolves watched. The girl watched too. She planted her feet in the scorched grass and kept the fence post up, and her expression did not waver, and she looked at the most powerful wolf alive, walking toward her, across a meadow full of fallen raiders, and said nothing at all. Not yet. But before we get to what she said, before we get to the moment that changed both of their lives and the history of every pack in the territory, you need to understand where she came from. You need to understand what 19 years of being told you are nothing does to a person. And you need to understand why. What when the worst night of her life became the night the Solara tore through her skin like sunlight through cracked stone. She did not let it stop her. She had 4 children at her back. She had never, in 19 years, had anyone at her back. She was not going to let them fall. This is the story of Avenna Coldridge. The first thing you should know is that Avenna Coldridge had never shifted. In a pack, that fact is not small. A wolf who cannot shift is not considered a wolf at all. They are considered, and the pack has specific language for this, language that is old and blunt and chosen to wound. A hollow, a body that the moon looked at and passed over, a thing that takes up space in the bloodline without justifying it. Avenna had heard every version of that language. She had been hearing it since she was old enough to understand words. The second thing you should know is that she did not have a pack name. Every wolf born into Ashbourne Pack was given a pack name at the first full moon after their birth, a name chosen by the Alpha, marking them as counted, as belonging. Avenna Coldridge had not been given one. Not because anyone forgot, because Alpha Draven Stoneheart looked at a newborn girl with no father on record and a mother already in debt to the pack treasury, and decided she was not worth the ceremony. Her mother called her Avenna. The pack called her Cinder. Not a woman. Not a wolf. A thing that burns low and produces nothing but ash. By the time Avenna was 14, she had mostly stopped thinking about it. Not because it stopped hurting, because she had learned what pain is for. When you live a life like hers, it is information. It tells you what the ground feels like, so you do not fall. It tells you where the walls are, so you do not run into them. It is not a thing to be held and examined. It is a thing to be noted and moved past. She was 14 the first time we see her clearly, down on her knees in the pack's fighting pit at midnight, a stiff bristled brush in her hands, scrubbing dried blood from the stone with the focused, economical energy of someone who has learned to be efficient, because inefficiency has a price she cannot pay. Nobody asked her to be there. Nobody put her name on a list and said, "Clean the fighting pit, Cinder." It did not work that way. It worked the way silence works. the absence of a thing communicating everything about what is expected. If the pit was not cleaned before morning, Alpha Draven would note it. And when Draven noted something, a thing undone, a standard unmet, a detail fallen through the cracks, he reached for whatever was closest and most expendable to make his displeasure known. And the closest, most expendable thing in Ashbourne Pack was always the same. So Avenna cleaned the pit at midnight. She had been doing it since she was 11. She counted while she scrubbed. It was a habit she had developed as a very small child, and she had never broken it. She counted the stones in the wall when she was trying not to listen to the enforcers talking about her mother. She counted her own steps across the yard when the loneliness got large enough to become physical. She counted the times she had cleaned this specific pit, 97, 98, and the number, while it did nothing to lighten the work, gave her something to hold on to. A record. Proof that she had been here, that these hours had existed, that someone was keeping track, even if that someone was only herself. Her hands moved without thought. That was how she had built them, through so much repetition that the work had become a body memory, something her hands did while her mind went somewhere else. Somewhere it could rest. Her mind went to the tree. There was a tree at Ashbourne's eastern fence line, an old one, with thick silver bark and roots that had grown so long and so sideways that they clutched the top of the boundary wall like a set of enormous hands. The tree had started life trying to grow straight up, the way trees do, and then something had happened. The ground had shifted, or the light was wrong, or the wind kept pushing it, and instead of dying, it had simply chosen another direction. It grew sideways, out over the wall, into the grey sky above the boundary, still alive, still growing, just not the way anyone expected. Every evening before dark, Avenna walked to that tree. She pressed her palm flat against the bark and stood very still and let her heart beat slow. She stayed as long as she could, 5 minutes, sometimes 10, depending on whether anyone was looking for her. Then she walked back and became cinder again. She had never told anyone about the tree. It was hers, the only 5 minutes in her day that belonged entirely to her. She was still thinking about the tree, about the way the bark felt rough and warm and alive under her palm, when she noticed it. A sound, or the absence of a sound. A change in the air, or she turned her head. A lame horse was being led through the far end of the yard. She knew what it meant. She had seen it before. 3 of Draven's enforcers walked alongside the animal, 2 at its flanks, 1 at its head, and the horse moved with the stiff, struggling gait of something in real pain, something that has been carrying its hurt for too long, and whose body has finally started to refuse. Avenna went still. Her brush stopped moving. She did not know why it hit her the way it did. She had seen animals hurt before. She had seen much worse than a horse being walked to the yard's far end, where things like this were done quietly, out of the pack's sight line. She was not a soft person. Softness had been something she had learned very early to keep small and well hidden, because softness in Ashbourne was an invitation. But something moved inside her chest, something hot and pressurized, rising the way a storm rises, not slowly but all at once, filling every space available to it. Her vision blurred at the edges. Her throat tightened. She gripped the brush rail so hard that her knuckles went white and the bones in her hand ached. It lasted perhaps 30 seconds. Then the horse made a sound, low, not dramatic, just the ordinary sound of something resigning itself. And then it was quiet, and the pressure in Avenna's chest receded the way a wave recedes, dragging back through the sand, leaving everything wet and cold and still. She did not know what that was. She had felt it before, less intensely, less clearly, but she had always managed to find something to grip until it passed. She had learned, you grip things until they pass. No, that is what you do when the feeling has no name and no home and nowhere to go. She finished scrubbing the pit. Then she walked back to the ash room. The ash room was behind the forge, a narrow space that had not been built to house a person. Technically, it had been a storage alcove for dry materials back when someone in the pack's history cared about keeping the forge well organized. At some point, before Avenna could remember, it had been assigned to her the way a tool is assigned a shelf, a bedroll on bare stone, walls permanently grey from years of forge smoke seeping through the cracks. One small window, so cracked that it let in more cold than light, and the cold it let in was the specific, personal cold of a space that has never once been warm enough. That was where Avenna slept. Not given. Assigned. Now she sat on the bedroll and pressed her scarred palms flat against her own chest. Her mother used to do that. Press a warm hand to Avenna's forehead when she had a fever. Solid and deliberate. The gesture of a woman who believed that a physical presence could communicate what words sometimes could not. Verella Coldridge had been dead for 3 winters. She had been a slight, serious woman with quick eyes and a debt to Draven that she had been repaying in installments since before Avenna was born. When she died, the debt passed. That was not a law. That was simply what Draven said, and in Ashbourne, what Draven said had the weight of law, because there was no one willing to say otherwise. Avenna had never been allowed to read the full document. She only knew its weight. She carried it every day, as in the specific way her body had learned to carry things, efficiently, without complaint, without letting the strain show in her face. She lay back on the bedroll, her palms still flat against her chest, and stared at the grey ceiling of the ash room. If there is anything in there worth keeping, she thought, not for the first time, not with bitterness, just with the quiet seriousness of a girl taking inventory. It has been very patient. She closed her eyes. Outside, the forge ticked and settled as it cooled. Somewhere in the pack house, a door closed. Voices passed. No one paused. No one said her name. The cold came through the cracked window, slow and steady, the way it always did. Avenna let it. She had learned, you do not fight the cold. You get through the night. You get up in the morning. Not you count the stones in the wall and the steps across the yard and the days. And you do not let the number feel like a weight. You let it feel like a record, like proof that someone was keeping track. She was 19 years old. She had been Cinder for 19 years. She did not know, could not have known, lying on that bedroll in the grey and the cold, that she had approximately 48 hours left of being no one. After that, the goddess herself was going to have something to say about it. The morning after the raid, Ashbourne smelled like smoke. The outer village, a loose cluster of small homes on the pack's southern boundary, had taken the worst of it. A band of rogue wolves from the east had come through in the middle of the night. They're the kind of raiders that no territory border fully stops because they do not respect territory as a concept. They burn, they take, they move on. By the time Ashbourne's sentinels responded and drove them back, 7 homes had been destroyed. 3 pack members were dead. The rest had fled toward the pack house in the dark and made it, except for the ones who had not been fast enough. Draven stood in the pack's main yard as the sun came up, surrounded by his inner circle, and delivered his assessment with the flat, calculating efficiency of a man who is already 3 steps past the grief and deep into the logistics. A border skirmish, he called it. A political opportunity, if handled correctly. Evidence of the Eastern Territory's lawlessness that he could bring to the Regional Council as justification for expanded border authority. The two of his lieutenants were nodding before he finished the sentence. That was the shape of Ashbourne's inner circle, men who knew which way the wind blew and adjusted their agreement accordingly. Avenna was not in the yard for this. She was already at the outer village, sent there with two of Draven's enforcers, Kyrox Ironheart and Daxton Grayson, broad and bored and carrying sacks, to salvage what could be saved from the wreckage before weather got to it. She moved through the ruins quickly and quietly. Charred beams, collapsed rooftops, the particular kind of silence that settles over a place where people lived yesterday and do not live today. She worked. She noted what was salvageable. She did not speak to Kyrox or Daxton more than necessary. They did not speak to her at all. She was lifting a section of collapsed wall, methodically, starting from the outside in, when she heard it. High and thin, coming from underneath. She stopped. The enforcers were 15 feet away, cataloguing a storage chest. Neither of them had heard it. Avenna crouched down, put her ear close to the rubble. There it was again. Not a cry, not a full sound, just the faintest possible breath of noise. The kind that comes from a throat that has been making sounds for hours and has nothing left, but still tries. She moved the rubble with her hands, not quickly, carefully, taking each piece off in the order that would not collapse what was above it. The enforcers noticed and wandered over. "Leave it," Kyrox said. "We're not here to dig." Avenna kept digging. "Cinder." His voice had an edge. Draven said salvage materials. Why not? The beam came free, and underneath it, in a space that had been, by some combination of luck and the specific way that particular wall had fallen, just barely large enough, there were 4 children. Mira was 6 years old. She was small for it, dark-haired, with a cut above her left eye that had stopped bleeding sometime in the night. She had her arms around the other 3. Kale, 5, pressed against her right. Leora, 4, tucked under her left arm, like a bird under a wing. And in the center of them all, the smallest, a boy of 3 named Pip, though Avenna would not learn his name for another hour, with dried blood in his hair from a wound that was not his own, and eyes that were open and clear and locked onto Avenna's face with a directness that 3-year-olds rarely manage. Mira looked up at Avenna. She did not ask for help. She did not say anything. She just looked, the look of a child who has been waiting in the dark for a very long time, who has already learned in the worst possible way that you do not always get rescued, who is looking at this stranger, trying to decide if rescue is actually what this is. Avenna held her gaze. "I have you," she said. "You're all right now. I have you." Something in Mira's expression, the held, careful, waiting thing, shifted. Just slightly. Just enough. The enforcers stood back. Avenna lifted Pip out first. He was limp with exhaustion, his small body heavy against her shoulder. She got the other 3 to their feet one by one, checked each of them over. No broken bones, no wounds beyond the cut on Mira's head, and then stood up with Pip still on her arm and looked at the enforcers. "We need to take them to the healer," she said. "We need to finish the salvage," Kyrox said. "They need a healer. And then what? Draven decides what happens to them, not you." He looked at the 4 children with the same flat efficiency he applied to the storage chest, assessing. "They're old enough to be useful. He'll place them." Avenna was quiet for a moment. "Place them where?" Kyrox shrugged. "Border debts are getting backed up. Pack labor until they're old enough for proper assignment." He said it the way people say things they have been trained to say, until the thing no longer has the shape of what it is. Come on. Leave them here until we're done, and we'll bring them in on the cart. Avenna looked at the 4 children. Mira was watching the enforcer with those dark, careful eyes. Cale had quietly taken Leora's hand. Pip's fist had found the hem of Avenna's dress and closed around it. She thought about the ash room, the assigned shelf, the debt her mother had signed that she had never been allowed to read in full, the specific shape of a life that begins with someone deciding you are useful and ends with no one ever deciding you are anything more. She did not plan what happened next. There was no calculation in it, no strategy, no weighing of consequences. There was simply a moment in which she understood, clearly and completely, the way you understand things that are true in the bones rather than the mind, that she was not going to do it. She was not going to leave them on a cart. She was not going to hand them to Draven Stoneheart to be assigned to board a debt like 4 small items in a ledger. She picked Pip up more firmly, took Mira's hand. Mira looked up at her. "Where are we going?" "South," Avenna said. "Away from here." She walked, not toward the pack house, away from it, toward the tree line at the edge of the outer village, the trees that led south, the direction that was simply not here. Behind her, Kyrox called her name, then called her Cinder, then shouted. His footsteps followed, and then stopped. She heard them stop at the edge of something, not a wall, just an edge. The place where the decision you are being asked to make outweighs what you were told to do. She did not look back. The trees closed around her, and the 4 children, and the pack house of Ashbourne was behind her, and the only thing ahead was the kind of unknown that does not feel like a threat when every known thing behind you has been a slow-motion harm for 19 years. Yet the exile notice caught up with her the next morning. A runner, young and fast, had been sent south before dawn. He found her in the forest at the creek crossing, the 4 children asleep in a pile against a wide fallen oak, Avenna awake and watching the tree line. He held out the folded paper without speaking. She unfolded it, read it, folded it again, tucked it inside her coat, against her chest, next to the debt notice that had been her inheritance. Mira had woken up. She was watching Avenna with those careful eyes. "What is it?" she asked. Avenna looked at the trees to the south. "A letter saying we are not welcome back." Mira processed this. "Were we going back?" "No." "Then it does not change anything." Avenna looked at the girl, 6 years old, cut above her eye beginning to scab, arms folded across her chest with an authority that her small body had absolutely no business projecting, and something in her chest moved. Not the pressurized fire thing, something quieter, something that felt, unexpectedly, like warmth. "No," she said. "It does not." She woke the other 3. She gave Pip the last of the dried meat she had taken from the salvage sacks before leaving. She had not planned ahead. She had not packed properly. She had 3 days of lean supplies and 4 children, and no wolf in a forest that was not safe. And she settled him on her back, and she took the south path. "Forward," she said quietly, to no one in particular, or perhaps to herself, or perhaps to the idea of the sideways tree that grew over Ashbourne's eastern wall, and had never once stopped growing just because it had to go a different way than expected. She walked. What she did not know was that the 14 raiders she had smelled as distant presences twice that day, still working the southern territories, still following the trail of an unguarded exile, moving slowly through the forest with the sound of children, had noticed her too. And they were not going to stop following, not until the second night, The second evening in the forest was colder than the first. Avenna had been navigating by the creek, keeping it to her left, using its sound to hold her course, because the sound of moving water is one of the things that does not lie to you in the dark. Or she had kept them moving at a pace calibrated to Leora's shorter legs, with Pip on her back shifting his weight every half hour or so, the way sleeping children do when they are being carried, never fully waking, just adjusting, trusting the body beneath them to keep being there. The children had been brave in the way that small children are sometimes breathtakingly brave, not loudly, not with declarations, but just by putting one foot in front of the other, because the person in front of them was putting one foot in front of the other. Mira walked without complaint. Cale had stopped asking questions 2 hours in, not because he had run out of them, but because he seemed to understand, in the way 5-year-olds sometimes do, that some questions are better asked later. Leora had found a smooth grey pebble somewhere on the path, and had been carrying it in both hands as a kind of talisman since midday. Pip had been silent for the past 4 hours in the specific way that worried Avenna most, the hollow, glassy quiet of a child who is too exhausted even for tears. She could feel the warmth of him on her back, the small weight of his head against her shoulder, but the silence was the silence of someone who had gone somewhere inside themselves to wait. She had not slept in 40 hours. She smelled them before she heard them. The wind shifted, just slightly, and the smell came with it, unwashed, blood-sharpened, something underneath it that her unnamed instinct, the part of her that was, though she did not know it, something ancient and awake and paying attention, translated without words. Does these wolves have been feral long enough to enjoy the hunt? She stopped walking. Ahead of her, the trees thinned into the edge of an open meadow. On the right side of the meadow, a stone wall stood mostly intact, the remnant of some old outbuilding that had collapsed in on itself, leaving one corner standing, maybe 4 feet high. A defensible wall, the only one available. She counted heartbeats in the dark. 14. She went very still. Then she moved, not fast enough to frighten the children, but with the purposeful, deliberate speed of someone who is making a decision and implementing it in the same breath. She got them to the wall, put Mira, Cale, and Leora against the stone, lifted Pip from her back and pressed him gently into Mira's arms. Mira looked up at her. Avenna. Stay here, Avenna said quietly. And keep Pip with you. Do not come out from the wall for any reason. She turned around. The meadow was open ahead of her. The trees at its edge were dark. She picked up the only thing available to pick up, a splintered fence post from the ruined outbuilding's debris, 3 feet long, one end still studded with old iron nails, and she raised it. The raiders emerged from the tree line in a loose arc. They moved with the unhurried confidence of predators who have already calculated the situation and found it entirely in their favor. Wolfless girl, 4 small children, no backup, open ground. They did not bother to shift. 14-1 in human form was already deeply unnecessary. Their leader was a broad man with a jaw that had been broken at some point and healed badly, by stepping to the front with his hands loose at his sides and an expression that was almost cheerful. He looked at Avenna, then at the fence post, then back at Avenna, with the particular condescension of a person who finds the idea of resistance amusing rather than concerning. No wolf, he said. No pack smell on you. Lone girl with a stick and 4 little ones. He tilted his head. Doesn't look like you belong to anyone. Avenna's grip on the fence post tightened. Something behind her sternum moved, not urgently, just present. The way a fire is present in a hearth whether or not anyone has asked for it. You should leave, she said. He smiled. It did not reach his eyes. Or what? The fight was not clean. It was not choreographed. It was the specific, unglamorous kind of fighting that happens when someone has no training and no real weapons and no options left. When every movement is just, survive this second, so there is a next one. Avenna took hits. She took them and she gave them back with the fence post, and she kept herself between the raiders and the wall, and she was losing. That is the honest truth of it. She was losing in the particular way that means you are running out of seconds. 3 of them came at her from the side, and she blocked 2, and the 3rd knocked her to the ground, and she got up, because getting up was the only thing left. Her skin was warming. She registered it distantly. A heat building under her skin, not from exertion, different from exertion, something else entirely. The fence post hummed faintly in her grip. She did not have the time to think about what that meant. The leader reached around her toward the wall, and Pip screamed. Not help, not a sound of general distress. He said her name, Avenna. 3 syllables in a 3-year-old's voice, with the full weight of every ounce of trust and love and need that a very small child is capable of, which turns out to be an extraordinary amount. Something broke. Not in her resolve, in the wall around the thing that had been building inside her for 19 years. The pressurized, unnamed, patient thing that had been gripping the fence rail in the yard, pressing its palm against tree bark, lying on cold stone in the dark, and asking if there was anything in there worth keeping. The answer, it turned out, was yes. The Solara didn't rise. It erupted. Gold-white light tore through Avenna's skin, the way sunrise tears through cracked stone, not gradually, not gently, not with any concern for the fact that nobody present was ready for it. It came from her hands first, then her arms, then her whole body, and the meadow grass scorched outward from where she stood in an expanding ring, and the fence post blazed in her grip like a torch that has been waiting 19 years to be lit, and the sound it made was not a sound at all but a feeling, the feeling of something very old and very certain arriving at the place it was always meant to be. The raiders did not know what they were looking at. That was the last thought most of them had, clearly, before the light made the rest of the night's decision for them. When it was over, or when the light had burned itself back to the faint gold glow at Avenna's skin that was all that was left of it, 11 raiders were on the ground around the scorched ring. 3 had made it to the tree line. The leader was one of the 3 who ran, which was perhaps the only good decision he had made all evening. Avenna stood in the center of the ring. She was shaking. Her arms were still faintly gold, the light fading slowly the way light fades after you have looked at the sun. Not all at once, but in layers, each one thinner than the last. The fence post was smoking in her grip. Her legs felt like they were made of something that was trying to become water. She turned. The wall, the 4 children. Mira's dark eyes over the top of Pip's head, wide and still and locked on Avenna. And then Mira ran. Kale came next, then Leora with her grey pebble still in her fist, and then, because Mira had put him down, Pip on his 3-year-old legs, moving with more determination and less coordination than any of the others, making straight for Avenna through the scorched grass. They hit her all at once, arms, faces, the warm, chaotic, absolute weight of 4 children who are alive and know it, and are communicating it with every square inch of their bodies. Avenna sank to her knees in the scorched grass, her body making the decision before her mind did. And the children piled against her, and her arms went around all 4 of them, and her hands always working, always scrubbing, always gripping things to stay upright against the cold. Held. They just held. For the first time in 19 years, someone held her back. She did not know she was going to say it. It came out on its own, pressed out by the tightness in her chest and the weight of all four of them, and the specific ache of something very large finally being put down. "I have you," she said. Her voice was rough and low and very real. "I have you. I have you." Pip's small fist was in her hair. Mira's arms were around her waist and were not letting go. Avenna pressed her face into the top of the nearest head and squeezed her eyes shut and let herself, just for this moment, be held. She did not hear the sound on the ridge until it was quiet, the controlled murmur of a vast column coming to a halt, a shifting of weight, of iron, of 400 bodies pausing together in the dark above the meadow. She opened her eyes, lifted her head. On the ridge above the tree line, against the dusk sky, were silhouetted shapes, a long, dense line of them, mounted, armed, 400 wolves, unmoving, staring down at her. At their head, a single figure dismounted. Avenna got to her feet. Her legs held, barely, but they held. She reached down without looking and picked up the fence post, and the faint gold at her hands steadied as her fingers closed around it. The figure on the ridge started down toward her. She planted her feet in the scorched grass. She squared her shoulders. She raised the fence post. Her arms were trembling with exhaustion she refused to show. Xaden Valahart had been king since he was 20 years old. He had not inherited a stable throne. His father had died in the 3rd year of a war that Xaden, at 19, had been old enough to fight, but not old enough to finish. He finished it at 22, that after 2 more years of the kind of warfare that takes everything you have that is not essential and removes it from you systematically until what is left is stripped down to something that works. His generals were afraid of him. His council respected him, without fully understanding him. His enemies were fewer than they used to be, because most of them had come to a specific conclusion about the arithmetic of fighting Xaden Valahart, and found it didn't add up in their favor. He had 3 things in the world he trusted entirely: his wolf, his general Eric's Ravenwood, and his own judgment. His wolf was vast, the way old wolves are vast, not in size but in weight, in the density of its presence inside him. It had never been soft. It had never been uncertain. In 14 years of war and governance, and the specific grinding loneliness of being the most powerful creature in a room full of people who want something from you, it had stayed hard and reliable and clear. Until this moment. Xaden walked down from the ridge toward the scorched circle and the girl with the fence post, and his wolf was doing something it had never done in his memory. It had gone still. Completely still. Not in the way it went still before battle. That was a coiled, compressed stillness, potential energy at its most dense. This was different. This was the stillness of something that has been moving for a very long time and has finally arrived at a place it recognizes. One word. Not a thought exactly. More like a fact, delivered from somewhere below language. Mate. He walked closer. No, she did not lower the fence post. He noted that. He noted everything about her, with the same methodical attention he applied to the opening hours of any engagement. The torn dress, the broken boots, the hands still carrying faint gold at the knuckles, the trembling that was present in every muscle that did not touch her face. She was in pain. She was exhausted past the point where most people find another gear. And she was standing in the center of a scorched ring with a blazing fence post raised at a king, because behind her there were 4 children, and she was going to make him go through her before she let them find out what he wanted. He stopped 6 feet from the edge of the scorched ring. "Step back," she said. Her voice was low and steady. "I don't know you." He stopped. Something behind his eyes shifted. Eric's. What watching from the ridge would say later that it was the first time in 9 years he had seen Xaden look surprised, not startled, surprised, the genuine kind. He looked at the scorched grass. He looked at the fence post. He looked at the 4 children arranged against the wall behind her, the smallest one with his fists in her dress, watching Xaden with enormous, unafraid eyes. He looked at her hands. The knuckles split. The scarring that went all the way up her wrists. Hands that had been working since they were small enough to fit in a child's palm and had never stopped. "Who did this to you?" he asked. It was not what she expected. He saw her register it. A brief flicker in those watchful eyes. A recalculation. "The raiders," she said, careful. He held her gaze. "I mean all of it." A silence. Long enough to have weight? Or she studied his face the way she had clearly learned to study everything. For the thing behind the surface, for the tell that revealed the actual intent. He let her look. He had nothing to hide. He had learned, a long time ago, that a man who has nothing to hide does not need to manage what his face does. "Who are you?" she said. "Xaden Valahart." A pause. "King of these territories." She did not react the way people react to that name. She did not step back. She did not bow. She did not recalculate her position relative to his power, the way people always do when they register exactly what he is. She watched his face and looked for the truth of him, and he found, to his considerable surprise, that he wanted her to find it, that the assessment of this specific set of eyes felt like something that mattered. "Why are you here?" she said. "We were riding east when my scouts reported light in the meadow." A pause. "We came down to investigate." He looked at the scorched ring around her. "I am glad we did." She still had not lowered the fence post, but her hands had shifted, just slightly, the wood dropping perhaps 2 inches, the angle less aggressive. Not trust. The first fracture in the wall where trust might eventually decide to grow, if given enough time and reason. "I'm not going back to Ashbourne," she said. "I am not asking you to. The children stay with me. I am not asking for them either." She looked at him for a long moment. "Then what are you asking?" Xaden thought about the right answer. He had one, but it was too large for this moment. Too much truth at once, or for a woman who was standing in a scorched ring with a fence post, having just channeled the most ancient gift the goddess had given in 8 centuries to a man she had met 40 seconds ago. So he gave her the smaller, true thing instead. "My healer, my wagon, my stronghold." He paused. "No conditions, just roof and warmth and someone who can look at those hands properly." She looked at her hands. The gold had almost fully faded now. What was left was the ordinary sight of them. Broken, scarred, knuckles split, the hands of a person who has been working since before they were big enough for the work. "Why?" she said. Not hostile, not challenging. Genuine. The question of someone who has never been offered anything without a visible price on the other side. "Because you are bleeding," he said. "And because those children are exhausted. And because—" He paused, something in his jaw, the particular tightening of a man saying something careful and true. "I think you have been carrying things alone for a very long time." The fence post came down to her side. Not all the way. Not dropped. Just held at rest rather than raised. The difference was small in the physical sense, and large in every other sense. She looked at him for another moment, that measuring, undeceived look. And then she looked over her shoulder at the 4 children against the wall. Mira was watching her, that direct, careful, trusting but not yet committed gaze. Avenna made a decision, not because she fully trusted the king, not because she had let her guard down, but because the alternative to accepting a warm wagon and a healer was another night in the cold with 4 exhausted children and a body that had just done something extraordinary and badly needed rest. And she had learned, over 19 years of doing hard things, that pride which costs children their safety is not a virtue. It is just another kind of harm. She turned back to Xaden. "The fence post comes with us," she said. Something moved in his expression. Very fast, very small. It might have been the beginning of a smile. "Of course," he said. Eric's had the healer at the column's edge before Xaden was back at the ridge. The woman, Zivara, quick-handed and warm, with the particular steadiness of healers who have seen everything, went to Avenna without ceremony and started on her hands. Avenna submitted to it with the wary cooperation of someone who has learned that rejecting all help is its own kind of pride. She sat on a supply chest and held out her hands and let Zivara work. Xaden stood at a careful distance and watched. Eric's moved to his shoulder. "She's wolfless, my king." Xaden did not look away from her. "I know." She channeled Solara. "I know." Eric's was quiet for a moment. "That hasn't been seen since—" "I know," Xaden said, quieter this time. His wolf pressed against the inside of his chest with a steady, patient warmth. "I know." When the column began to move east toward the Velhart stronghold, Avenna was in the supply wagon with Pip across her lap and Mira's head against her shoulder. Kale and Leora were asleep against the wagon's far wall, sharing a traveling blanket that someone, Xaden, though Avenna would not confirm this until later, had sent back from the supply stores at the column's front. Through the gap in the wagon's canvas, Avenna could see the ridge receding behind them and the dark trees moving past on either side and the back of the column's formation, orderly and quiet. And at the very front of it, barely visible, the figure of the king on his horse. Once, just once, without turning in his saddle, he reached back and adjusted the canvas flap over the wagon's entrance so that the wind coming from the east did not hit the interior directly. His hand made a small, unhurried movement. A deliberate thing, and then it was done, and he was facing forward again, and the column moved on. Avenna watched his hand do it. She looked at it for a moment, at what it meant, or at the smallness of it, and the largeness of what the smallness communicated. Then she looked at the top of Pip's head, heavy and warm against her knee. She looked away before the king could turn. The Velhart stronghold was built into the side of a ridge, which meant that in the morning the sun came from above rather than from the side, and the whole eastern face of the building was lit up by it in a way that made the stone look almost warm, almost living. Avenna stood at the window of the room they had given her, large, simply furnished, with a real bed and a real blanket and a window wide enough to sit in, and looked at the light on the stone and thought, this is what a building looks like when it was built for the people inside it, and not for the impression it makes on the people outside. It was, she was aware, a strange thing to think, but she had lived her whole life in a building that was built to impress. Draven's pack house was full of high ceilings and heavy doors and rooms that announced authority, and then spent her nights in the ash room behind the forge. She knew the difference between what a building claimed and what it offered. This one offered light. The children had their own room down the corridor. 2 beds pushed together, so none of them had to sleep alone, which had been Myra's quiet, non-negotiable requirement, and which had been met without discussion. Avenna had checked on them before dawn, and found all 4 of them in a pile in the middle of the pushed-together beds, Pip's arm thrown over Cale's shoulder, Mira with her back against the wall, and her face finally, relaxed. In the morning, she watched Cale eat. He had both hands around a warm bowl of something thick and grain-sweet, and he was not eating the way hungry children eat, fast and anxious, always monitoring whether there would be more. He was eating slowly, deliberately, like someone testing a theory, like someone who has learned that food appearing doesn't mean food staying, and is cautiously, carefully, beginning to revise that belief. Leora and Cale discovered the courtyard after breakfast, and within 10 minutes had established a circuit. In the gate, around the training post, past the water barrel, out through the archway and back in again. That they ran with the sudden, explosive, full-body energy of children who have been given space and safety for the first time, and are using every square inch of it. Pip woke in the late morning and sat up in the big bed and looked at the blanket beneath him. He pressed both palms flat against it, feeling the softness with the seriousness of a person taking a careful measurement. "It's soft," he said. Avenna, sitting on the edge of the bed, felt her throat tighten. "Yes," she said. "It is." He looked up at her. "Is it ours?" She looked at his small, serious face. "For now," she said. "Yes." He considered this. Then he nodded, as if reaching an internal conclusion, and lay back down and went to sleep again. Avenna sat on the edge of the bed for a while after, her hands in her lap, and did not move. Zivara came to re-wrap Avenna's hands each morning. She worked quickly and without drama, cleaning and applying salve and re-wrapping with the practiced efficiency of someone who treats wounds for a living and has learned to make the patient feel like the care is ordinary. On the 3rd morning, when she finished and sat back, she looked at Avenna's palms, the old scarring layered under the newer damage, the calluses built up over decades of work. "You've been working your whole life," she said. Avenna glanced down at her own hands. "Yes." Zivara looked up. "You don't have to here." Avenna had no response to that sentence. She had heard variations of it, in tone, in implication, from Draven's circle before, and the version from Draven's circle always meant, "You are not here to work right now. You are here to wait for the work I have decided on for you." But Zivara's version sounded different. It sounded like it simply meant what it said. "You do not have to work. You are allowed to rest." Avenna carried the sentence around for 3 days, like a stone she had found and could not put down. She did not know what to do with it. She had never had to know. She found the library on the 2nd day. It was off a back corridor, not prominently placed, not locked. She had pushed the door open, half expecting to be redirected. In Ashbourne, certain rooms were not for her, and the library had been one of them. The collection of texts on pack law and history and bloodline records that Draven kept behind a lock, because some knowledge, he believed, was power, and power was not for everyone. This library had no lock, and no one came. She went back every day. She did not see Xaden often. He ran a stronghold and a territory, and had the administrative apparatus of a king to manage, which meant that most of his hours were not his to choose. But she noticed. Because she noticed things. Because 19 years of watching for the shift in a room's temperature had made her very good at noticing that the east corridor's wide window seat was always empty when she arrived at dusk. Not just sometimes. Every evening. As though its use by anyone else had been quietly, informally discontinued. She sat there each evening and watched the sun go down over the ridge, and she did not examine too closely why she had started arriving at the same time every night. One evening, on the 6th day, he passed the corridor and paused. He was not in armor. He wore the simple dark clothes of a man who had been in meetings all day, and had taken the long route back to the eastern wing because the long route was quieter. He stopped at the edge of the corridor and looked at her, sitting in the window seat, with a book open on her knee and the light going gold outside. "May I?" he said, gesturing at the far end of the window seat. She moved her feet. He sat down. There was a careful distance between them. He looked out at the ridge. She looked at her book. Neither of them spoke for a minute or two. Then he said, "Eric's tells me you've been in the library. Is that a problem?" "No, I'm glad." A pause. "What have you been reading?" "History of the Solara Gift." She kept her voice neutral. "I wanted to understand what happened in the meadow." He was quiet. "Then what did you find?" "That it has not manifested in 8 centuries, that it cannot be trained or inherited." She looked at the book in her lap, then up at him. "That the goddess gives it only to those whose love for others is, the text says, complete, unguarded." She closed the book. "I don't know if that's what I am." He looked at her for a moment. "You carried 4 children out of a burning village, because no one else was going to. You ran into the dark with nothing. You stood alone in an open meadow with a fence post against 14 raiders because there was a child at your back who needed you to." A pause. "I think the goddess would say she had good data." Avenna was quiet. The light outside turned deeper gold. "The ash room," she said. Not as a complaint, just as a fact, or the way she had learned to say the hard things, plainly, without inflection, taking the emotion out of it, because keeping the emotion out of it had been how she survived the thing itself. She told him about it briefly, the size, the cold, the cracked window, the 19 years. He listened. He did not interrupt. He did not make the sound people sometimes make when they hear hard things, the sympathetic sound that is more about their own discomfort than the person speaking. He just listened with the complete focused attention of a man who has decided this matters. When she finished, he was quiet for a moment. Then, "I will not pretend I can undo what was done to you there. I know. But I can promise it is the last room you will sleep in that was meant to make you feel like less." She looked at him directly, not measuring this time, just looking. "That is a large promise for someone who does not know me." He met her eyes. The light was nearly gone outside the window. In the dimness, his face was very clear, and the thing behind his eyes was very clear, and it was steady and patient and unperforming. "Then let me know you," he said, "and the promise will be smaller." She looked at him for a long time. Then she looked back at the ridge, and so did he, and they sat in the window seat in the fading light, and neither of them spoke again for another half hour, and it was not the silence of 2 people who have nothing to say. It was the silence of 2 people who have found a quiet and are not in a hurry to fill it. When she left, she noticed on her way out that the fence post, which a stronghold servant had removed from the window ledge to clean earlier that week, was back on the sill. She had not put it there. She stood in the doorway for a moment and looked at it, that scorched and splintered length of wood that had come with her from the meadow, that she had carried all the way here because she needed something to remember what it felt like to fight when fighting was all there was. She went to bed. For the first time in as long as she could remember, she did not need to count things to get to sleep. He did not tell her he was going. He had spent 4 days before he went learning her history. Not from her, because she had not offered it, and he was not going to ask her to perform her own suffering for his benefit. He learned it from the border runners who moved between territories, from the pack records that Ashbourne was obligated to file with the King's office, and which no one in Draven's circle had thought to check might be reviewed, from the specific way Avenna moved in rooms, always with her back near the wall, always with her weight slightly forward, always with one eye on the door. He learned it from the shape of her silences, and the angle of her hands when she was not working, and the fact that she had visibly startled the first time Eric's raised his voice in the corridor, even though the raising was directed at someone else, entirely. He did not need her testimony. He had enough. He rode to Ashbourne at the head of 200 warriors, in full war colours, on the 12th day, and Alpha Draven Stoneheart received him in the great hall, with the prepared composure of a man who has already composed his justifications and arranged them in order of plausibility. He had Beta Xavian Westfall at his right, and his inner circle filling the space behind him, and the wolves of Ashbourne arranged in the hall in the same way they had always been arranged, power at the front, compliance behind, and the understanding that everyone present was here to validate the conclusion Draven had already reached. Xaden came in without ceremony. He stood in the center of the hall and looked around it slowly, at every face, one by one, the way a man takes inventory of a room when he has a specific and non-negotiable business to conduct there. And then he began. He did not raise his voice, but that was the first thing the hall noticed, and the thing it would remember longest, that the most powerful wolf alive came to dismantle everything they had built their lives on, and he did it quietly, the way the tide comes in. He named the ash room. He described it in full, the dimensions, the cracked window, the bare stone floor. He named the forge it sat behind, and the cold that came through it, and the fact that it had been the living space assigned to a girl who had lived in it for 19 years without once being offered an alternative, because no alternative had ever been considered. The hall was quiet. He named the debt ledger. He had a copy, obtained from the King's office, where pack debt agreements were registered. He read the terms aloud, slowly, and so that everyone in the room could hear exactly what Varela Coldridge had signed, and exactly what Draven had required of her daughter in the years following her death. The terms, the conditions, the fact that they had been written in a way that a motherless girl with no legal representation could never satisfy in full, and Draven would have known that when he wrote them. The hall was quieter. He named the 4 children. He said each of their names, Mira, Kale, Leora, Pip, slowly and with care, because names matter. Because a child who has been called border debt offset by the man responsible for their safety deserves to have their actual name spoken in the room where that decision was made. He described where they had been found. He described what Draven had called them. He watched the room as he said it. A few faces in the hall went through something. It was visible, a ripple, a reconfiguration, the specific shift of people who have been managing a convenient version of something and have just been shown what it actually was. Then Xaden named the Solara. He explained it, what it was, what the histories said about it, when it had last appeared and under what circumstances. He explained that it cannot be trained, that it cannot be inherited, that the goddess gives it only to those whose love for the people around them is so complete, so unguarded, so free of self-interest, that the body itself becomes a vessel for something that the rest of the world does not have access to. He paused. He looked at Draven Stoneheart. You had the rarest soul on this continent in your pack for 19 years, he said. was in a voice that was very quiet and very precise, the voice of a blade rather than a club. "You put her in the ash room." The silence that followed was not polite. It was the hollow, specific silence of a hall full of people who are looking for a defense, and finding, one by one, that every available defense is itself a confession. The wolves who had called her Cinder the loudest were the quietest now. Because they had understood it, all at once, in the way you understand things that are true and enormous and cannot be unfelt once they arrive. They had not overlooked a clanless girl. They had overlooked the goddess's chosen, and the goddess, unlike Draven, keeps receipts. Draven opened his mouth. Xaden turned his gaze on him, and whatever Draven had been about to say did not find its way out. He closed his mouth. That, too, what was something the hall would remember. The formal decrees followed. Draven's authority was stripped. The territory was placed under Xaden's appointed overseer, pending full audit. The enforcer unit was to be disbanded and reassembled under new command, with full reporting to the king's office. The debt ledger, every outstanding document bearing Virella Coldridge's name, or Ravenna's, was declared void. The enforcers disarmed. Each weapon hitting the stone floor made a single, clean sound that echoed through the hall. The first one was the loudest. By the time the last one landed, the sound had become something else entirely. Not the percussion of weapons being surrendered, but the rhythm of a reckoning working its way to the end. When it was done, Xavian Westfall stepped forward. He had not spoken during any of it. He had stood at Draven's right and listened, his expression unreadable in the way of someone taking a very long, honest look at something they would prefer to have not looked at. He was not one of the ones who had called her Cinder the loudest. He was one of the ones who had been quietly, consistently, insufficiently decent, the kind of decency that leaves bread on the tray and says nothing when the tray is too small. He stopped in the center of the hall. He placed his closed fist against his chest, the old, pre-formal gesture, the one that predated the pack hierarchy and could not be performed ironically. A bow owed to a person who has been wronged. Not to a king, to a person. He inclined his head. "She deserved better than every one of us gave her," he said, "including me." He did not ask for absolution. He did not frame it as an apology designed to release him from responsibility. He said it the way you say something when you have looked at what is true for long enough that the looking no longer has an agenda. The hall was silent. It was not absolution. It was not meant to be. But it was the only honest thing spoken in that room in 19 years, and in a hall that had been filled with convenient dishonesty for almost 2 decades. Honesty, even late, even incomplete, has a weight that is hard to ignore. Xaden rode back to the stronghold in the evening. He arrived at the edge of the 9th hour and went directly to the east corridor. She was in the window seat. He sat beside her. They looked at the ridge. The light was low and gold and long. After a silence, she said, "You went." Not a question. "Yes," he said. A pause. "Or you didn't have to." "I know." She looked at her hands in her lap. The healer had rewrapped them that morning, fresh and clean. "Thank you," she said. The words cost something. He could hear it, the specific weight of them coming from someone for whom receiving care is not simple, for whom gratitude is tangled up with all the years of not being given anything to be grateful for. He did not make it smaller by deflecting. "You are welcome, Avenna," he said. Her name, not Cinder, not girl, not a task or a descriptor or a thing that needed doing. Avenna. Her name, in his voice, without anything attached to it except itself. She had heard her name before. Her mother had said it. Mira had said it. Pip had screamed it in a meadow and set the world on fire. But in this voice, in this corridor, or at this particular hour, it sounded like something she had not heard it sound like before. It sounded like the name of someone who existed. Someone who had a claim to the space they occupied. Someone the world had chosen to see. She looked at the ridge. He looked at the ridge. The light faded slowly, in layers, the way light does, and neither of them moved for a long time. 5 weeks later, Mira was the most dangerous child in the Stronghold's training yard. She had found her way to the sparring group on her own initiative. A young training officer named Erickson Thornwell, 22 and mildly startled by the small person standing at the yard's edge, watching the drills with critical assessment, had offered to show her a basic stance. Mira had watched him demonstrate it once, replicated it exactly, and then given him detailed feedback on his footwork. He had gone to Eric's the next morning with the particular expression of someone who has had their worldview mildly reorganized, and reported that there was something happening in the training yard he thought the general should know about. Eric's had gone to look, and had come back to Xaden with the same expression. Xaden had gone to look himself. He had stood at the yard's edge and watched Mira working through a form she had been taught 4 days ago, with the focused, precise intensity of someone who has decided this matters and is therefore going to be excellent at it. He did not say anything. He went back to his war room and added a note to the Stronghold's training records. 1 additional student, long-term placement, full program. Cale had, in the same 5 weeks, conducted what could only be described as a sustained campaign directed at Soraya Nightwell, the Stronghold's head cook. It had begun on the 3rd day, when he discovered that the kitchens existed, and that the kitchens contained, among many other things, honey cakes. It had proceeded through several phases of careful negotiation, appearing at the kitchen door at specific hours, offering to carry things, developing opinions about which herbs went better with which grains, until Soraya, a formidable woman not given to sentiment, had told Eric's with complete directness that if anyone tried to move the small boy elsewhere, she would consider it a matter requiring formal grievance. Eric's had relayed this to Xaden. Xaden had adjusted the household assignment records accordingly. Leora had found a cat. It was a large, grey, a deeply opinionated animal that lived in the east courtyard, and had previously belonged to no one and intended to continue that arrangement. Leora had decided otherwise. By the end of the 1st week, the cat, whose name was Dusk, a matter Leora considered permanently settled, and which the cat had not objected to with sufficient force, slept at the foot of her bed. The rest of the Stronghold had collectively decided not to interfere with this, because Leora had looked at each of them, at various points, with an expression of polite but absolute certainty that made clear the arrangement was not up for discussion. Pip followed Xaden. This had begun on the 8th day, when Pip had escaped the children's quarters through a door that a new hall guard had not thought to secure, and had made his way through the Stronghold's interior by some combination of instinct and determination, until he found the war room, where Xaden was in the middle of a strategy session with 4 senior generals and a significant amount of territory maps. He had walked in, looked at Xaden, crossed the room with the absolute confidence of a 3-year-old who has decided something is true, climbed the king's chair using the armrest, and settled himself on the king's knee. The 4 generals had looked at this, then at the king. Xaden had looked at the small person now occupying part of his lap, and at the maps on the table, and at his 4 generals. "Continue," he said. Avenna had arrived, breathless, 10 minutes later, and she had pushed the war room door open and found the king of the territory in full session with his senior military council and a 3-year-old on his knee, and the 3-year-old was holding a corner of the map with both hands, because he had decided it was his job to hold the map, and nobody had told him otherwise. Xaden had looked up at her from across the table. She had looked at the situation, then at Pip, then at Xaden. He had not looked embarrassed. He had looked, she thought, almost like a man who had been quietly hoping for exactly this situation. Like a man who has been running a continent's worth of territory alone for too long, and has recently arrived at the private conclusion that a 3-year-old on his knee during strategic planning is the most honest thing that has happened in that war room in years. "Oh, I'll come back," she said. "There's a chair," he said, "if you want it." She had stayed. The evening conversations had been continuing for 5 weeks now, in the window seat in the east corridor, at the same hour every night. They had moved through stages, from careful and brief to long and ranging, to the comfortable thing they had become, where neither of them needed to manage what they said, because managing it had gradually become less necessary than simply being present. On the 36th night, she told him about the tree. She told him about it quietly, in the same plain voice she used for hard things. And this was not a hard thing. It was a tender thing, which is harder in a different way. She told him about the 5 minutes every evening, the bark under her palm, the way her heartbeat slowed. Or she told him that she had been pressing her palm against things, trees, fence rails, stone walls, her whole life, looking for something that felt solid. He listened. When she finished, he said, "What did it feel like?" "The tree." She thought about it. Like proof that something alive could hold on in a place that gave it nothing. He was quiet for a moment. Then, "You were describing yourself." She looked at him. "And you didn't even know it," he said. She was quiet for a long time. The ridge outside was dark. The stronghold was settling around them into the particular quiet of an hour when most of its people were asleep. Pip's voice, high and bright and always slightly too loud, had gone silent an hour ago from the direction of the children's wing. Somewhere in the east courtyard, as a cat was probably doing whatever dusk did at this hour, which was presumably whatever it wanted. "I've been reading more," she said. "I know. Zivara said you've been through most of the eastern shelf." "The mate bond section." She said it plainly, her eyes on the ridge. "I know what it is. What I felt in the meadow when you walked down from the ridge." A pause. "I read that it goes both ways." He said nothing, but she could feel the quality of his stillness change. The particular stillness of a man who has been very patient and has just been told that the waiting is almost over. "I want to know what you intend to do about it," she said, still plain, still direct, still, somehow, the least romantic delivery of the most significant possible question. And he smiled. It was not the controlled expression she had seen in their early conversations, or the careful restraint of the past 5 weeks. It was the genuine, unguarded thing, the one that changed his whole face, that moved through it from the eyes outward, that made him look entirely like himself, and nothing like a king. It was the face of the man beneath the crown, and it was, she thought, a very good face. "Whatever you will allow," he said, "at whatever pace you set." She looked at him, at that smile, at the patience behind it, not the patience of someone waiting for something they plan to take, but the patience of someone who has found the thing they want and is genuinely, entirely willing to wait for it to come to them on its own terms. She nodded, slowly. Once. It was not a declaration. It was not a ceremony. It was simply agreement, or two people deciding, without fanfare, that the thing between them was real and was theirs and was going to be handled with care. That night, when the evening ended, and they stood in the corridor outside the east wing to part, Xaden reached out and took her hand. Not to lead her anywhere, not to make a point, just to hold it. Both of his hands around one of hers, her scarred, calloused, slowly healing hand, held in both of his with the careful, complete attention of someone who understands that this particular hand has been carrying things for a long time and is allowed, now, to rest. He did not say anything. She did not pull away. They stood in the corridor for a moment that had no particular length, long enough to mean something, short enough to remain its own thing, rather than becoming part of the next thing. Then she squeezed his hand once, a small and deliberate pressure that said everything it needed to without a single word, and she walked to her room. He stood in the corridor for a long time after she had gone. Eric's found him there, eventually, and had the very good judgment to say absolutely nothing. In the morning, Avenna was at the east window early. The sun came from above, over the ridge, and hit the stone of the stronghold's eastern face in the way she had noticed from the first day, making it look almost warm, almost alive. The children's voices rose from the courtyard below, Pip's high shriek of delight, Mira's commanding tone explaining the correct way to do something to Cale, who was almost certainly not doing it the way Mira considered correct. Leora insisting on something about dusk. Avenna pressed her palm flat against the stone window ledge. The stone was warm from the morning sun. Her hands were still scarred. They had been scarred for so long that she had stopped imagining them any other way. But the scarring had been done by years of work that was not her choice, and what the hands did now, what they would do from this morning forward, was her choice. That was a different thing entirely. She was not braced against anything. She looked at the fence post on the windowsill beside her, scorched, splintered, still carrying the faint smell of that meadow if you were close enough. The most unlikely reminder in the history of the Valihart stronghold. The thing she had picked up off the ground because it was all there was, and had not put down until it was over, and had carried all the way here because she needed something to remember. She did not need it to remember any more. She had 4 children's voices coming through the courtyard window. She had a king with patient eyes who had moved his whole schedule around a window seat so that she would never arrive and find it taken. She had a healer who told her she did not have to work. She had a library with no lock and a corridor that was hers at dusk. She had her name, spoken without anything attached to it, except the person it belonged to. She looked at her open palm against the warm stone, and she thought, not with the old counting urgency, not with the keeping track quality of someone who is the only one keeping track. She thought simply, I am here. I am here. I am here. Not as proof. Not as a record against the possibility that no one else would notice. Just as a fact. A warm, solid, present fact. The way the stone was warm. The way the sun was there above the ridge every morning, whether anyone was watching for it or not. She had spent 19 years being told she was cinder. She had never once stopped being fire. She had just, for a very long time, not had anything worth burning for. And then 4 children came out of the rubble of a burning village, and a king walked down from a ridge in the dark, and the world that had tried to make her nothing found out, slowly, thoroughly, and without any possible room for revision, that it had miscalculated. The goddess had been watching, the goddess had been patient, and the goddess, unlike Draven Stoneheart, does not make the same mistake twice.